Hey folks, Nathan here. This is my YouTube channel, and this is the second episode dealing with the DC deck building game in our ongoing series, Nate's Favorite Deck Building Games. Last time we took a look at the original set and a lot of information about how the game is actually played. Aside from changes to gameplay and such, we're going to try to avoid digging into that again in this video and onward. So if you haven't watched the first video in this series, you probably should. Look for Nate's Favorite Deck Building Games DC Deck Building Game, or DC DBG Part 1 to get that information. Now we're looking at the second of the large sets to be released. This is Heroes Unite. And frankly, Heroes Unite doesn't really do a whole lot to change up the gameplay. It's more just, hey, here's a bunch of new cards to play with if you're tired of playing with the original one, or if you want to change things up and mix them together, as you generally can with most deck building games and their various expansions or new additions. So let's take a look here at Heroes Unite. Again, I would point out that while I am going to be using a playmat to show you how this game plays, or show you at least a little bit more about this particular set, the playmats for DC deck building game do not come with it. None of the sets thus far have come with any kind of playmat or a fold-out set of rules that has maybe a playmat type thing on the back, or a game board, or anything like that. You're expected to just play using a standardized layout on a normal table, unless you spring the money to buy yourself a playmat. I find that Heroes Unite is one of the easier playmats to find at this point. I do think that it is out of print now, but there's still quite a few places that has it available. Same thing we'll find with Forever Evil, the third set. It's really just that first one that we saw last time that's not only out of print, but actually hard to find without breaking the bank. As before, this game has you playing as a superhero, so we have 7 oversized superhero cards to play with. They are the characters you actually see here on the mat. We have Nightwing, Batgirl, we then have Booster Gold, Hawkman, Shazam! Instead of calling him Captain Marvel, they call him Shazam on the card. And then we have Black Canary, and we have Red Tornado. So, we have our 7 superheroes here. We're going to start with our regular starting decks of 7 punches and 3 vulnerabilities. They have got new art. You tend to see that as we go from set to set. Unlike something like Ascension, the artwork does tend to change. There's our vulnerability that now shows Batgirl getting punched around a little bit there. Then we have our kicks. As before, the ones that are always available, cost of 3, 1 victory point that give you 2 power. That'll be sitting here. We also have our weaknesses. Again, those ones that could be put into your deck by card effects and things like that. Cost of 0, a -1 victory points, and nothing else that it does. And of course, we have our main deck. Same card types as before, right? Villains, heroes, locations, equipment, superpowers, same old things we saw before. In this case, we have 111 cards for this particular deck. So sit those down there. We'll wind up with 5 of them, again, rather than 6, making up our so-called lineup here. They all work essentially the same as we saw before. And then we have our supervillains. Again, we're given more supervillains than we'll use in any specific game. So we have 12. We pull out Vandal Savage, because like Ra's al Ghul, he's the one that's required to be first in the game. Of the other 11 cards, we will randomly pick 7, and then take those 7 and place them face down, rather than the 11, just to have a place to put them here. Over there under supervillains, with Vandal Savage there on the top. Now this pretty much plays exactly like its predecessor. The only real difference, and I would say it's a minor difference, is that the way that some of the superheroes have their abilities worded sometimes give you what amounts to 2 abilities that sometimes either stack on each other or are related to each other. So in the case of Nightwing, the first time you play an equipment during your turn, +1 power. The second time you play an equipment during your turn, draw a card. So 2 different things, but you have to do one before the other, but they can both trigger on the same turn. Booster Gold, +1 power for each defense card you play during your turn, and when you avoid an attack, draw a card. So when you use the defense, you get +1 power based on having played it, but also you've got that ability to draw a card once you avoid an attack. So even if a defense is somehow stopped, you still wind up getting that +1 power, but if you avoid the actual attack, if the defense actually works, you can draw a card. Otherwise, they're all pretty much standard abilities. Basically, what this set seems to be is, hey, you don't want to play with the A-list Justice League characters we saw in the first set? Here, play with some of the, I want to say B-list, but let's call them the A- list characters of DC, and hey, let's give you some new cards to play around with. So they're all kind of themed after the general villains you'll see for these particular heroes, as opposed to Batman villains, Superman, and so forth, like we saw in the original game. And yes, I probably don't have to say it, it does come with a full rulebook. None of the DC deck building game big sets thus far have ever turned around and said, hey, here's a rulebook, but no, it's just for the new stuff, go and download the original one online the way that some of the Ascension ones did. And I keep saying big sets, there's really just this size of set as a regular set. It's not like there's big and small of these standalone games like there was for, say, Ascension, but there are expansions that aren't sets like this that are designed to enhance ongoing games rather than being games in and of themselves. So they're more like the recent multiplayer game expansion that was put out for Ascension, Alliances, I believe it was. So in that sense, there is sort of a big and small box thing, but when I say a big box set, I just mean a regular size set, about the same size set you would see with any regular set of Ascension. Honestly though, nothing more to see here. So let's jump out of Heroes Unite and check out the third main set, which is Forever Evil. The third regular set was a little bit different here for the DC deck building game. That is Forever Evil, based on the comic storyline of the same name, which has you playing as the super villains going after the superheroes. It's also going to introduce a couple new types of token into a game that so far hasn't used any tokens yet. I would also note here that if you look at the box, that artwork is different than the artwork on the official playmat. And again, the official playmat is not included. You are not playing actually as the villains that are on here, or some at least of the villains that are on here. So when we get to the villains, the super villains you can play as, we'll actually take a look at which ones are available in this game because it isn't readily obvious by the playmat or the box. So I've laid out some cards here, and you notice there are some slight differences. So we have our main deck, which again is 111 main deck cards. We still have hero, equipment, villain, superpower, and location cards that are available to us. The only real thematic difference being that usually the type of abilities, the type of effects you would have seen maybe on hero cards before have now been put on the villains, and the things that you might have seen on villain cards before tend to be on the heroes. But either way, pretty much all still plays the same as far as that goes. You will find sometimes, though, that a card effect will perhaps freeze another card. And that's where these come in. A brand new concept of frozen tokens that are only in this set as far as the main sets go so far. It says frozen on one side. The other side notes, this card cannot be bought or gained. In other words, if I put a frozen token on, say, Insanity, no one can actually acquire that card anymore, either gaining it through a non-buying process or just buying it outright with power. Can't do it until something removes the frozen token. Also of interest here is the fact that if you look, there's these new tokens sitting up here called VP or Victory Point tokens. Basically, to win the game before, you were acquiring cards or defeating supervillains and using that victory point down at the bottom to just add them all up, subtract in the case of weaknesses, 1 each time of course, and at the end of the game, whoever had the most victory points wins. Well, it's still about getting the most victory points, but now certain actions that get taken can give you or cost you victory points. So instead of having cards to represent those, you have little tokens here of 1 or 5 or 10 to be able to give yourself and take away those victory points very easily without them having to be tied into an acquired card. It's kind of like honor tokens and honor points in Ascension, right? You can get the honor tokens to give you honor points, but you also at the end of the game count up whatever the number is on the bottom of the card. Same general idea here. Interestingly, the VP tokens didn't get brought back for the 4th set in the series, just are here for Forever Evil. We, of course, then for our decks are going to have our punches that have different artwork yet again, 7 of those, along with 3 vulnerability, again with different artwork here, because hey, you can't have a game that's based on villains be looking at superheroes doing something heroic. It's got to be the villains doing something villainous, quasi-heroic. We have our kit cards there. Same except for the art. Once again, same thing with weakness. One of my favorite weakness arts here for the decaying hand there for Hal Jordan. And then, of course, we have the big difference, which is the way that the heroes and villains work. Because usually, you play as a superhero with an oversized card, and you're trying to take out the super villains, which are villain cards with special abilities that are all stacked up over here that you're trying to take out as you go. Well, this time, the villains include you. So the super villains, the 7 oversized cards we get this time, are actually super villains that you're playing as, not going after. So you can choose from, since they are different than on the mat here, Sinestro, Lex Luthor, Deathstroke, Bizarro, Harley Quinn, Black Manta, and Black Adam. All of which, of course, have different abilities to go with them, as in the case of the other games so far. But you're going after the superheroes. So the color schemes have essentially been swapped here. And just like there's always one you have to start with in the other two, same thing here. You're going after the Flash first in your villainous deeds. For what it's worth, the other superheroes you can go after are Shazam, Green Arrow, Cyborg, Constantine, Aquaman, Green Lantern, Batman, Swamp Thing, Wonder Woman, Superman, and Martian Manhunter. So not all characters we've seen as superheroes in previous games, but the majority of them certainly are. Again, you've got 12 of these total. You got one that has to go on top, so the other 11, you randomly pull 7 of them, put them in a random order, and stick them down as your superheroes. Otherwise, the game plays essentially like all the others. The only big difference is, again, aside from just conceptually that you're the supervillain versus the superheroes rather than the other way around, is yes, you can get victory points in a way that's other than acquiring a card, so be keeping an eye on your tokens for those, and there's tons and tons and tons of tokens here. In fact, the book, if you look at the rule book, it actually says, when it comes to the contents, 1 oversized supervillain, or 7 oversized supervillains, 1 rulebook, 6 frozen tokens, lots of victory point tokens. It doesn't tell you how many, it just says lots. And then we've got our frozen tokens over here. So that frozen ability is new, and having victory point tokens as a concept is new, but otherwise it plays the same, barring just a swapping of concepts rather than any new game mechanics being added in. A lot of folks I've talked to enjoy this one just because the turnabout to being able to play as a villain going after the heroes. It does make it a little weird to combine this set with other sets when it comes to the main sets. And the fact that you do have to carry around the victory point tokens and the frozen tokens can be a little bit annoying depending on how you tend to carry your cards. We wouldn't get back to dealing with heroes until the 4th set. So let's take a look at that one. The last big set so far, with one more coming very soon, is Teen Titans. And you'll notice that while it has the Teen Titans there on the box, which sort of lets you know who you're going to be able to play as your superhero, there's not a playmat yet. At least not that I have seen. There may be one that I just haven't managed to get my hands on, but as of right now, as far as I know, no playmat for Teen Titans. Now this one can use the regular playmats as opposed to Forever Evil because we're back to not using victory point tokens or frozen tokens. We're back to basically the same style of gameplay as we saw back in the original set and Heroes Unite, but with some refinements to it, mainly in terms of the way the supervillains are going to work. So we again have our rulebook, as one would expect, and then lots and lots of cards. We have 112 as opposed to 111 main deck cards. They are all of the types we've seen before, so we have locations, superpowers, equipments, heroes, and villains. A lot of times we get a mixture of these. I'm just putting them out so we can see all the different types. The only real distinction made between this set and previous ones in terms of a refinement for these regular cards in the main deck is that the locations now just say location and have the word there in black instead of in sort of a purplish color. And underneath it just says ongoing and tells you that it's an ongoing card. Prior to this set, all the locations had to tell you every time this has to be put in play and stay in front of you. The assumption is you got to know what a location card is in order to play it anyway, so why do we have to keep reminding you of that? So now location cards look a little more like the others, just with sort of the black and white reversed, as opposed to the ones that tend to have the dark background and black text. We do have some that are white with other colors, but this one is designed to hopefully stand out and be a little more eye-catching, or so they say. I think they all look kind of alike now. You once again will be starting out with a deck that has 7 punches. So we have our redesigned punch card that works exactly the same way as it always has. Same thing with your 3 vulnerabilities for each starter. We have our always available kicks that again work the exact same way as they have before. Same thing with our weaknesses. Then we have our superheroes, which in this case are Teen Titans. So we have the regular version, I say regular because we're going to see a promo version of her, the regular version of Starfire, Red Robin, Raven, Blue Beetle, Beast Boy, and Wonder Girl, followed by, of course, Superboy, who looks quite a bit different here than some of the other things we see of him in the artwork that was drawn from, I believe, the New 52. We have our 7 heroic characters we can play as, and then, of course, we have to have our supervillain stack, and once again, we are given 12 DC supervillain cards, but with a twist. Okay, so first off, yes, we have one that has to start on top, okay? That is Slade Wilson in this case. He has a regular ongoing ability, which means that he has an ability that when you play him becomes an ongoing ability. So you have to acquire him first into your deck, draw him, then play him, and the ongoing effect takes place, just like a location would, or this particular superpower, tactile telekinesis, has an ongoing ability, or the hero Bumblebee has an ongoing ability. Okay? Plays like a regular ongoing ability. But there are some of these cards that are going to have a thing that says stack ongoing. Okay? At the start of each player's turn, that player gains a weakness and then puts a 0-cost card from their discard pile on top of their deck, at least in this one's case. As long as this card is flipped facing up while it's sitting on the stack of supervillains. Okay, so not while it's face down under the stack, but while it is face up in the stack, its ability is taking place. So every turn for every body, you're getting smacked around by this guy until you finally defeat him. You'll also note that unlike the rest of these cards that we've seen through these games, Trigun, who is the strongest of the villains, the hardest to defeat, and worth quite a bit, has a blue back. So, as before, you have 12 supervillain cards. Used to be, for all these other sets, that you would have the one that has to be on top, and of the other 11, you randomly chose 7 in random order to stick underneath it. Now, you have the one that has to be on top, the blue one has to be on the bottom. He's kind of like the final boss of the game, and you randomly choose 6 of the other remaining cards, the other remaining 10, and randomly put them sandwiched in between, face down. So it's kind of making sure that we don't wind up in a situation like I've mentioned previously, where you wind up with the super duper powerful villain as the second one that winds up popping up in the stack, and now that supervillain is causing you to play the game as you simply deplete the main deck rather than defeating villains because it's too early in the game to face a villain that powerful. Now, it puts him down there on the bottom. Now, the other ones are still random in between, so you could wind up in a situation where you find yourself in a similar spot to what I just described, but it won't be from the single most powerful villain in the stack, which is Trigun. So they've addressed it, but it could still happen, but hopefully it'll be rarer than it otherwise would have been in the previous sets. In fact, a lot of people that I know who play this game tend to play the original 3 sets as if they're playing with this set, in that they wind up making sure that whichever one is the most powerful supervillain is included and is at the bottom of the supervillain stack. But that's nowhere in the rules for those games, so it is not a requirement. As I said though, otherwise this game will play exactly like the others. You just have some new twists to the damage that the supervillain can do to you while it's sitting in the stack, not just when it first comes out or when it gets used later in the game. And the fact that we now have sort of a big boss, a final boss of the game that's waiting there no matter how many times you play and what variants you get in between him and the first villain to kick your butt until you defeat him. And that concludes our look at the first 4 regular sets. 1 in the last episode, the other 3 in this episode. What's coming up soon? We're going to be taking a look at the promo cards. We're going to be taking a look at the 6 crossover packs so far, at the 1 Rivals game so far, and we'll be taking a look at the 3 so-called Crisis expansions. If you want to play the game, you're going to need 1, at least, of these 3 starter sets or the upcoming Confrontation set that is not released as of the time of this recording. We'll be back with more DC Deck Building Game.